In Greek mythology, no family carries a shadow as deep, as relentless, and as violently self-perpetuating as the house of Atreus, a bloodline in which guilt is inherited like a birthmark and suffering passes from one generation to the next, as if ordained by the gods themselves. The curse begins long before Atreus is even born, rooted in acts so grotesque that they seem designed to poison time itself. It starts with Tantalus, a favoured mortal of the gods who was welcomed at their table, a rare honour that should have guaranteed prosperity and reverence for his descendants. Instead, driven by arrogance and a desire to test divine omniscience, Tantalus committed an unthinkable crime. He murdered his own son, Pelops, cut him into pieces, and served him to the gods as a meal. Though the gods immediately recognized the atrocity and restored Pelops to life, the damage was irreversible. Tantalus was condemned to eternal torment, and his family line was marked by divine disgust, as if the universe itself recoiled from their blood. Pelops survived, but even his resurrection could not cleanse the stain. As he grew into manhood, he continued the legacy of moral corruption, bribing the charioteer Myrtilus to sabotage a race, so he could win the hand of Hippodamia, then murdering Myrtilus to avoid paying his promised reward. With his dying breath, Myrtilus cursed Pelops and all his descendants, sealing a fate already rotting from within. From Pelops came Atreus and Thyestes, brothers whose rivalry would define the next catastrophic chapter of the curse. Their hatred was not a simple sibling feud, but a consuming obsession, fed by betrayal, lust for power, and a complete erosion of moral boundaries. Thyestes seduced Atreus's wife and stole the golden ram that symbolized kingship, prompting Atreus to commit one of the most horrifying acts in all of myth. He murdered Thyestes' sons, cooked their flesh, and served them to their unsuspecting father at a banquet meant to signal reconciliation. Only after Thyestes had eaten did Atreus reveal the truth, presenting the severed hands and heads of the children as proof. This moment crystallizes the essence of the house of Atreus. Violence not as passion, but as ritual, cruelty not as impulse, but as carefully planned spectacle. Thyestes, shattered and maddened, cursed Atreus in turn, and sought divine guidance, which led him to commit incest with his own daughter, in order to produce a son, destined to kill Atreus. That son, Aegisthus, fulfilled the prophecy, murdering Atreus and continuing the cycle rather than ending it. Atreus's own sons, Agamemnon and Menelaus, inherited not only a throne but a destiny soaked in blood. Menelaus's marriage to Helen would ignite the Trojan War, a conflict that cost countless lives and further entrenched the family in suffering. Agamemnon, as leader of the Greek forces, committed yet another unforgivable act when he sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to appease the goddess Artemis and secure favourable winds for his fleet. Though framed as necessity, the act was a profound betrayal of both paternal duty and moral law, and it ensured that the curse would demand repayment. When Agamemnon finally returned home after 10 years of war, he was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus, a killing portrayed not merely as revenge, but as an almost cosmic correction for the sacrifice of Iphigenia. Yet even this act of vengeance did not bring closure. Instead, it passed the burden of blood guilt to the next generation. Orestes, son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, was commanded by the god Apollo to avenge his father, forcing him into an impossible choice: obey divine law and kill his mother, or refuse and betray his duty. When Orestes chose to commit matricide, the curse reached its most psychologically devastating form. He was hounded by the Furies, ancient embodiments of vengeance, who drove him to madness, symbolizing that some crimes cannot be justified, even when commanded by gods. The tragedy of the House of Atreus is not simply the number of deaths or the extremity of its violence, but the inescapability of its suffering. Each generation acts under the shadow of the previous one, believing their crimes are justified responses to earlier wrongs. Yet each act only deepens the wound. Love becomes a weapon, family bonds become tools of destruction, and justice is indistinguishable from cruelty. Unlike heroes who fall due to hubris or villains who choose evil freely, the members of this family often seem trapped, pushed forward by prophecy, divine manipulation, and inherited guilt. The curse does not merely punish wrongdoing. It ensures that every attempt to resolve injustice creates new atrocities, turning the family into a closed system of pain. Even when Orestes is finally acquitted in a divine trial, and the Furies are transformed into benevolent protectors of justice, the resolution feels uneasy, as though the curse has been contained rather than erased. The House of Atreus stands as the darkest meditation in Greek mythology on the nature of fate, responsibility, and inherited trauma, suggesting that some sins echo so loudly through time that even gods struggle to silence them. In their story, Greek myth confronts the terrifying idea that evil can become systemic, passed from parent to child, not through intention alone, but through the very structure of existence, making the House of Atreus not just the most cursed family in Greek mythology, but a timeless symbol of how violence, once normalized, becomes destiny itself. The horror of the House of Atreus deepens even further when you look not only at what its members did, but at how inevitable everything feels, as though the family is caught inside a machine built by the gods themselves, grinding flesh and sanity into dust with each generation. What makes this family uniquely cursed is that no crime ever stands alone. Every atrocity is both a response to the past and a seed planted for the future. The dead never remain silent in this lineage. They speak through prophecy, through madness, through the whispering guilt that drives the living to repeat the very acts they despise. Even moments that resemble hope quickly curdle into new forms of suffering, as if the curse actively resists resolution. When Pelops was restored to life by the gods, it could have been a chance for renewal, a miraculous resetting of fate. But instead it became proof that resurrection without moral healing only prolongs the agony. Life itself becomes part of the punishment. The family's violence is especially disturbing because it is so intimate. This is not war between strangers or clashes of distant kingdoms. It is parents killing children, children killing parents, spouses betraying one another, siblings locked in endless rivalry. Meals become instruments of horror, weddings become preludes to slaughter, and homecoming, normally a moment of joy in Greek myth, becomes a signal for murder. The banquet where the Estes unknowingly eats his own sons transforms the most basic human ritual of nourishment into an act of spiritual annihilation. Eating, which should sustain life, becomes a mechanism of death, reinforcing the idea that within this family even survival is contaminated. No one can consume anything. Food, power, love, without poisoning themselves or others. The women of the House of Atreus are often portrayed as monstrous or unnatural, yet their actions reveal another layer of the curse, how suffering distorts love into something unrecognizable. Clytemnestra's murder of Agamemnon is frequently framed as betrayal, but it is also the cry of a mother whose child was slaughtered by her own husband in the name of war and divine approval. Her rage is not born in a vacuum. It is shaped by the same moral logic that justified Atreus's banquet and Agamemnon's sacrifice. Violence is presented as duty, revenge as justice, and obedience to gods as moral necessity. In such a world, tenderness becomes impossible. To love deeply is to risk unbearable loss, and so love mutates into control, manipulation, and vengeance. Orestes' descent into madness represents the psychological endpoint of the curse. Earlier generations expressed their trauma outwardly through brutality, but Orestes internalizes it, becoming a living battleground for conflicting moral laws. He is both criminal and hero, murderer and avenger, victim and perpetrator. The furies that pursue him are not just supernatural beings, but manifestations of inherited guilt, proof that some burdens cannot be reasoned away or judged into oblivion. Even divine intervention offers no true comfort. Apollo orders the matricide. Athena presides over the trial, and yet the outcome feels like a compromise rather than redemption. Justice in this family is never clean. It is negotiated, delayed, rebranded, but never erased. What truly sets the house of Atreus apart from other tragic families in Greek mythology is that awareness does not save them. Many characters understand that they are cursed. They speak openly of fate, prophecy, and inherited doom. Yet knowledge brings no escape. In fact, it often accelerates the tragedy, because attempts to outmaneuver destiny become the very actions that fulfill it. Atreus tries to secure his throne and ends up damning his bloodline. Agamemnon tries to win a war and loses his family. Orestes tries to restore justice and destroys his own sanity. The curse thrives on intention, feeding on the belief that one final, decisive act of violence will finally balance the scales. It never does. The House of Atreus ultimately becomes a meditation on generational trauma, long before the concept existed as a psychological term. Children inherit not only land and titles, but unresolved rage, unpunished crimes, and unspoken grief. Each generation grows up surrounded by silence about past horrors, yet those horrors shape every decision. The dead are never properly mourned. At this final depth, the curse begins to resemble a kind of moral gravity, an invisible force that bends every intention back toward the same outcome, no matter how sincerely someone tries to move away from it. The House of Atreus does not lack moments of awareness. It lacks the freedom to trust awareness. Insight appears like light in a sealed room, visible, undeniable, and yet useless, because there is nowhere for it to go. Knowing becomes another burden to carry, another proof that even understanding cannot undo what has already been set in motion. The family's tragedy is intensified by the way responsibility becomes collective while relief remains individual. Everyone is bound by shared guilt, shared memory, shared obligation, yet no one is allowed private release. Suffering is communal, healing is solitary, and therefore impossible. The curse ensures that pain is always public and visible, while mercy remains internal and suspect. Anything that cannot be witnessed, measured, or validated by the cycle feels unreal. This is why forgiveness never gains traction. It cannot be proven. Blood can. Over time, The family begins to confuse inevitability with dignity. There is a grim pride in enduring what others could not survive. Their suffering becomes a badge, a quiet claim to seriousness in a world that feels frivolous by comparison. This pride is not arrogant, it is defensive. It protects them from the terrifying thought that all this pain might not have been necessary. The curse feeds on this pride, because as long as suffering feels dignified, it will be defended rather than questioned. The House of Atreus also reveals how cycles persist through physimal, moral concessions. No single act feels like total surrender. Each decision is framed as temporary, situational, regrettable, but required. Yet these small concessions accumulate until nothing else is possible. The curse does not demand absolute devotion all at once. It asks only for one more step, one more justification, one more exception. By the time the family realizes how far they have gone, turning back would require dismantling everything they believe about themselves. There is a terrible absence of gentleness in this lineage, not because gentleness never appears, but because it never finds reinforcement. Each attempt at softness is punished by circumstance, betrayal, or interpretation. The family learns that tenderness has no allies. Without support, it withers. The curse ensures that cruelty is always rewarded with clarity and gentleness with confusion. Over generations, this trains the family to associate pain with certainty and kindness with risk. What makes the story so unbearable is that the family's logic works briefly. Violence fades, resolve immediate tension. Revenge fades, restore a sense of balance for a moment. Action fades, silence anxiety. If only temporarily, the curse is not sustained by lies alone, but by partial truths elevated into absolutes. The relief vengeance provides is real, but fleeting, and instead of questioning why relief fades, the family repeats the action that once worked, convinced it will work again if only executed more completely. As the cycle tightens, the family's inner lives shrink further. Reflection feels indulgent, hesitation feels dangerous, speed becomes virtue, decisiveness becomes morality. The curse thrives in urgency because urgency eliminates reflection. When everything feels immediate, there is no time to imagine alternatives. The future collapses into the next response. Eventually, the House of Atreus reaches a point where suffering no longer even demands explanation. It simply exists. The why becomes irrelevant. Pain is no longer justified. It is assumed. At this stage, the curse no longer needs narrative. It has achieved total internalization. The family does not ask why they suffer. They ask only what must be done next. And when that question finally runs out of answers, the story ends, not because something new is chosen, but because nothing remains to choose. The lineage fades not in resolution, but in depletion so complete that even repetition becomes impossible. The curse has consumed not only lives but momentum. The most unsettling aspect of this ending is that it offers no moral closure. There is no assurance that the suffering taught wisdom, no sign that the universe took note, no promise that balance was restored. The myth denies transcendence, it denies redemption, it leaves only absence, and the unsettling realization that nothing intervened, because nothing called Fey intervened once the system was complete. And so the House of Atreus becomes less a story about punishment, and more a study of what happens when pain is allowed to organize reality itself. It shows how suffering, when left unquestioned, does not fade, it crystallizes. It becomes law, identity, tradition, and truth. The curse is terrifying precisely because it feels rational from the inside. Every step makes sense. Every action feels earned. Every repetition feels justified. That is why the myth endures. It does not rely on monsters or miracles. It relies on the ordinary human desire for meaning, control, and coherence in the face of loss, and shows how easily those desires can build a prison no one remembers choosing. In the end, the House of Atreus does not ask us to fear fate or gods. It asks us to fear what happens when suffering is never allowed to end without explanation. When pain must always be answered rather than absorbed. When memory is obeyed rather than honoured. And the final, lingering question the myth leaves behind is not whether the family was cursed, but whether curses persist only because someone, somewhere, is still afraid to be the one who lets the pain stop without compensation. At this ultimate extension of the curse, even Hope becomes suspect. Hope is no longer an innocent desire for something better. It is treated as a dangerous distraction, a weakness that could loosen the discipline required to survive. The House of Atreus learns to mistrust hope, because hope tempts one to lower defences, to imagine outcomes not guaranteed by precedent. And precedent is the only currency the family trusts. Hope asks for faith without proof, and faith without proof has already cost them too much. The curse teaches that expecting less is safer than longing for more. This suspicion of hope reshapes emotional survival into a kind of austerity. Wanting is minimized, dreams are narrowed. The family learns to live within strict internal limits, not because they lack desire, but because desire feels like an invitation to loss. If one expects nothing beyond endurance, then nothing can be taken away. The curse thus produces a bleak form of emotional self-protection, starvation as safety. The tragedy deepens when endurance itself becomes sacred. The ability to continue despite devastation is praised, remembered, admired. Yet this reverence for endurance quietly replaces any concern for well-being. To survive becomes more important than to live. Pain is not questioned as long as it can be borne. The curse thrives in this reverence, because it transforms suffering from a problem into a virtue. Once pain is moralized, there is no reason to end it. As generations pass, the family's emotional inheritance becomes so heavy that even compassion for oneself feels forbidden. Self-forgiveness would imply that one's existence is not entirely defined by debt. But debt is the organizing principle of the curse. To forgive oneself would be to step outside the system, to claim a humanity not conditioned on repayment. The House of Atreus never allows itself this grace. Selfhood remains subordinate to obligation. There is also a profound distortion in how the family understands fairness. Fairness is no longer about minimizing harm, it is about equalizing pain. A world in which suffering is distributed evenly feels more just than one in which suffering stops unevenly. This belief ensures that mercy is withheld until it can be perfectly symmetrical. And since symmetry is impossible, mercy never arrives. The curse thus disguises cruelty as fairness and stagnation as integrity. What is most devastating is that the family cannot imagine a legacy that is not defined by harm. Legacy in this lineage means what one leaves unresolved. Influence is measured by how many lives are shaped by one's wounds. To leave behind peace would feel like leaving behind nothing. The curse convinces the family that only pain echoes loudly enough to endure. As the cycle grinds on, identity collapses further into function. Individuals no longer ask who they ask what they are for. Their worth is measured by usefulness to the cycle, by how effectively they avenge, endure, or carry forward memory. Love becomes conditional on loyalty to suffering. Those who hesitate are viewed as threats, not because they are disloyal, but because they expose the possibility that loyalty itself might be optional. Eventually, the family reaches a point where even grief is exhausted. There are no tears left, no outrage left, no language left to name what has been lost. The curse has consumed not only the future, but the emotional response to its absence. This emotional desolation is the true end. Not death, not silence, but numb continuation until continuation itself collapses. When the house of Atreus finally disappears, the absence is unsettling, precisely because it lacks meaning. There is no sense that justice has been done, that balance has been restored, or that suffering has been redeemed. The world simply continues without them, indifferent. This indifference is the final cruelty of the curse. It reveals that the universe does not guarantee meaning in exchange for pain. Meaning must be chosen, and the family never had the freedom to choose it differently. The story thus leaves us with a final brutal clarity. Suffering does not demand repetition. It demands acknowledgement. At the furthest edge of the curse, something almost paradoxical happens. Suffering becomes comfortable, very not pleasant, not desired, but familiar in a way that steadiness can masquerade as safety. The house of Atreus learns to navigate pain the way sailors learn to navigate storms, not by escaping them, but by memorizing their patterns. Pain becomes predictable, and predictability feels safer than hope. Hope requires trust in an unknown future. Suffering at least obeys rules the family understands. This is how the curse secures its final grip. Not through terror, but through familiarity. In this familiarity, imagination withers. Imagination is dangerous because it suggests alternatives, and alternatives threaten the coherence of everything endured. The family stops asking, what life fey could fey be, and limits itself to what life fey has been fey. The past becomes a template rather than a warning. Every new situation is interpreted through old wounds, ensuring that the same responses are chosen again and again. The curse does not force repetition. It makes repetition feel sensible. There is also a quiet moral exhaustion that settles over the lineage. When every action is justified as necessary, justification itself loses meaning. Moral reasoning becomes performative, a ritual enacted after the fact rather than a guide before action. Decisions are made first, explained later. Over time, the explanations become thinner, less convincing, until they function only to reassure the speaker that they are still acting within the bounds of something recognizable as justice. The curse does not eliminate conscience, it dulls it through overuse. The family's inability to imagine mercy as strength is one of the most tragic distortions the curse creates. Mercy is misunderstood as erasure of pain rather than acknowledgement of it. To show mercy feels like declaring that what was suffered did not matter enough to demand repayment. The house of Atreus cannot accept this interpretation, because it would collapse the meaning they have built around endurance. And so mercy is rejected, not because it is weak, but because it threatens to invalidate suffering that has already shaped everything. As generations pass, the emotional cost of this worldview accumulates quietly. The family becomes deeply tired, but never rested. Fatigue becomes a permanent condition rather than a temporary state. They carry it the way one carries a heavy coat that can never be removed. This exhaustion seeps into decision, making narrowing perception further. When one is tired enough, the easiest option becomes the only visible option. The curse thrives on this fatigue, because tired people do not imagine revolutions. They repeat habits. The myth also suggests that there is a moment early in the cycle when the curse could have been broken, not through heroism, but through grief. Grief fully felt, without conversion into action, grief allowed to exist without purpose, without compensation. But such grief is terrifying. It offers no structure, no task, no narrative of progress. It is pain without direction. The House of Atreus never permits itself this vulnerability. Action always arrives too quickly, cutting grief short and redirecting it into vengeance. In this way, the family is not destroyed by grief, but by its refusal to endure grief without transforming it into violence. What makes the story so unbearable is that the curse never demands belief. It functions whether or not anyone believes in it. Even skepticism becomes irrelevant once behavior has been shaped. The family may question fate, resent the gods, or curse their inheritance, but they still act in accordance with it. The curse has already done its work by shaping expectations, instincts, and limits of imagination. Belief is no longer required when structure remains intact. As the lineage thins, the tragedy becomes strangely impersonal. Individuals blur into one another, distinguished less by personality than by position in the cycle. Names matter less than roles. Avenger replaces son, victim replaces mother. The curse erases individuality, not through violence alone, but through repetition. When every life follows the same arc, uniqueness becomes irrelevant. This is the final theft. The family is denied not only peace, but particularity. When the story finally stops, it does not feel finished. It feels abandoned mid-thought, as though something essential was never said, never attempted. This incompleteness is deliberate. The myth refuses to tidy itself into moral resolution. It leaves behind discomfort rather than closure, insisting that the listener carry what the family could not resolve. And perhaps that is the final function of the curse, not to teach the family, but to teach those who come after. The House of Atreus becomes a negative space, an absence shaped like a warning. It shows what happens when suffering is allowed to organize identity, when memory becomes command, and when justice is defined only as return. The story does not ask us to condemn the family. It asks us to notice how easily we might become them, how quickly pain can feel meaningful, how seductive repetition can be when uncertainty feels unbearable, how comforting it can be to believe that the past dictates the future, because that belief relieves us of the responsibility to imagine otherwise. In the end, the most cursed family in Greek mythology is not defined by how much blood was spilled, but by how completely suffering replaced imagination. Their tragedy was not only that they could not escape the cycle, but that they could no longer see escape as real. And that is the quietest, deepest horror the myth leaves behind, that the most dangerous curses are not imposed from outside, but built slowly, patiently, out of perfectly human attempts to make pain mean something. At the very limit of what the curse can teach, it reveals its most unsettling deception. It convinces the family that fey continuation is responsibility fey, To stop feels not only frightening, but unethical. Ending the cycle feels like abandoning ancestors mid-sentence, like refusing to complete a task that has been handed down with sacred seriousness. The house of Atreus learns to interpret restraint as negligence, mercy as moral laziness action. Any action, even destructive action, feels more responsible than stillness. The curse thrives on this misinterpretation because it turns destruction into duty and refusal into guilt. This sense of inherited obligation slowly replaces any personal moral compass. Ethics are no longer internal judgments. They are inherited expectations. Right and wrong are measured not by present harm, but by fidelity to the past. The family does not ask whether an act will cause suffering. They ask whether it aligns with what has already been suffered. Pain becomes precedent. Once suffering has occurred, it demands imitation. The curse thus transforms history into law, and law into violence. There is also a devastating loss of emotional privacy. Grief is never allowed to remain personal. It is immediately absorbed into collective memory and weaponized. Individual sorrow is not honored for its uniqueness. It is converted into fuel for the next act. This denies the family one of the most basic human rights, the right to suffer without being conscripted by that suffering. Pain is never just pain. It is always preparation. Over time, this produces a lineage that cannot tell the difference between healing and forgetting. Healing feels like betrayal because it lessens urgency. Forgetting feels like treason because it releases obligation. The curse exploits this confusion, making it seem as though the only way to honor the dead is to reenact their wounds. Memory becomes rigid, stripped of nuance, incapable of transformation. It no longer remembers who people were, only how they were wronged. What makes the house of Atreus so haunting is that it demonstrates how trauma can masquerade as wisdom. Experience is mistaken for insight. Survival is mistaken for understanding. Longevity is mistaken for truth. The family assumes that because something has endured, it must be correct. The curse does not need to argue its case. It points to history itself as proof. And history, saturated with blood, appears to agree. As the cycle continues, even resistance becomes stylized. Acts that appear rebellious still operate within the same moral framework. Killing in the name of justice is still killing. Defying one command by obeying another changes nothing. The curse is flexible enough to absorb dissent as long as dissent does not question its core logic. In this way, rebellion becomes just another role the system can accommodate. True disruption, refusal to participate at all, remains unthinkable. Eventually, the family reaches a state where suffering no longer produces reaction. Tears dry up, rage dulls, horror fades. What remains is mechanical persistence, a grim continuation without belief. This is the curse's endgame. Not drama, not agony, but emptiness. When pain no longer even feels meaningful, the system collapses under its own weight. Nothing remains to justify continuation. And when that collapse comes, it is not mourned properly. There is no ritual sufficient to contain what has been lost. The story ends without ceremony, without explanation, without redemption. The silence that follows is not sacred. It is unresolved. It leaves behind a moral vacuum that demands interpretation from those who hear the tale. That is why the House of Atreus endures not as a closed story, but as an open wound in mythology. It does not instruct. It confronts. It does not reassure. It accuses. It refuses to tell us that suffering is noble or that justice is guaranteed. Instead, it asks whether we can imagine an ethics not built on repayment, a memory not enforced through repetition, a future not enslaved to the past. Beyond even this, the curse reaches a point where it begins to hollow out the very concept of fey choice fey itself. The House of Atreus does not merely believe its actions are inevitable. It gradually loses the emotional capacity to experience alternatives as real. Possibility becomes abstract, theoretical, almost insulting. To suggest that things could be otherwise feels like denying the weight of everything that has already happened. Choice, in this world, feels like mockery, an idea invented by people who have not suffered enough to understand how heavy the past can be. And so the family moves forward, not because it wants to, but because stopping would require believing in a future that does not yet hurt. The curse also trains the family to mistake control for safety. Every act of vengeance, every calculated betrayal, every preemptive strike is an attempt to wrest order from chaos. If one can predict the next violence, plan it, execute it, then perhaps it will hurt less. Perhaps it will feel less like ambush and more like intention. This desire for control is deeply human. Yet within the House of Atreus, it becomes lethal. Control replaces trust. Strategy replaces vulnerability. Life becomes something to manage rather than experience. And the tragedy is that the more tightly the family grips control, the more completely it is consumed by the very chaos it fears. There is also a terrible narrowing of empathy over time. Not because the family becomes crueler, but because empathy becomes unbearable. To fully feel another's pain would mean reopening wounds that never healed. It would mean acknowledging that everyone involved, including enemies, is acting from the same raw places of fear and loss. That recognition would dissolve the moral clarity the curse depends on. And so empathy is suppressed, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. The heart closes to survive, even as that closure ensures the cycle continues. The curse further reveals how easily ritual replaces reflection. Actions are repeated because they have always been repeated. Revenge follows murder because revenge has always followed murder. No one pauses long enough to ask whether the ritual still serves its purpose, or whether it ever did. Ritual provides structure, and structure provides comfort, even when the structure is destructive. In the House of Atreus, tradition becomes a machine that continues running long after its original meaning has been lost. As suffering compounds, the family also loses the ability to imagine forgiveness as something active and powerful. Forgiveness is misunderstood as forgetting, as weakness, as surrender. It is never seen as an act that requires strength, courage, and sacrifice of a different kind. Because forgiveness is passive in appearance, it is dismissed in favor of violence, which feels decisive and visible. The curse thrives on this misunderstanding, ensuring that only actions that cause harm are recognized as meaningful. There is a haunting absence of future-oriented language in the family's inner world. They speak constantly of what has been done and what must be answered, but rarely of what could be built. Creation is eclipsed by correction. Repair is eclipsed by retribution. The future exists only as a continuation of the past, never as a departure from it. And because nothing new is imagined, nothing new can be born. By the end, the House of Atreus does not collapse in a dramatic explosion. It withers. Its energy is spent not on living, but on maintaining balance sheets of pain. When life is reduced to accounting, joy has no place, love has no leverage, hope has no currency. The curse does not kill the family outright. It starves it of reasons to exist beyond obligation. What makes this ending so unsettling is that it offers no moral reassurance. There is no divine voice declaring the suffering meaningful, no cosmic balance restored, no final revelation that explains why it had to be this way. The universe does not apologize. It simply moves on, indifferent to how much was destroyed along the way. The silence that follows feels less like peace and more like abandonment. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of the curse. It promises meaning through suffering, but delivers only silence. It insists that pain must lead somewhere, that blood must buy resolution, that endurance must be rewarded. And then, when everything has been given, it offers nothing in return. The House of Atreus endures because it exposes a truth many myths avoid, that suffering does not automatically ennoble, that awareness does not guarantee change, and that justice pursued without mercy can become indistinguishable from cruelty. It shows how cycles persist, not because people love violence, but because they fear emptiness more than pain. The story ends without telling us how to break such a curse. It only shows us the cost of never trying. It leaves us with the burden the family could not carry, the responsibility to imagine a future that does not answer the past in kind, to honor memory without reenacting it, and to believe without proof, that letting pain end does not make it meaningless. Until that belief is chosen, again and again, the House of Atreus does not remain safely sealed in myth. It continues wherever suffering becomes identity, wherever revenge feels like duty, and wherever the courage to stop feels more terrifying than the courage to continue. There is, at the deepest layer of the curse, a quiet theft of fée wonder fée. The House of Atreus lives in a world where nothing is allowed to surprise them gently. Surprise exists only as threat. The unexpected is not curiosity, but danger. This robs life of one of its most human qualities, the ability to be astonished without fear. Beauty does not interrupt their suffering, it only heightens their awareness of how fragile and temporary everything is. A peaceful moment is not savoured, it is counted down, measured by how soon it will be destroyed. The curse teaches them that nothing good is allowed to last, and so goodness becomes emotionally inaccessible even when it appears. This loss of wonder has devastating consequences. When nothing inspires awe, nothing invites humility. The world feels hostile rather than mysterious, mechanical rather than alive. The family does not ask fais oui fais in order to understand. They ask fais oui fais only to assign blame. Curiosity collapses into suspicion. Reverence collapses into fear. The curse flattens the emotional landscape until survival is the only remaining horizon. There is also a subtle cruelty in how the family is denied the right to be ordinary. Ordinary lives require the freedom to make small mistakes without catastrophic consequences. But in the House of Atreus, every mistake reverberates across generations. There are no minor choices, only fatal ones. This pressure crushes spontaneity. Life becomes a performance staged under relentless scrutiny, where every action must justify itself against an invisible tribunal of the dead. Existing becomes exhausting, not because of constant action, but because of constant consequence. The curse also reshapes how the family understands forgiveness. Forgiveness is seen not as an internal release, but as a public declaration that must be justified, defended, and accounted for. To forgive without permission, from ancestors, from gods, from memory itself, feels illicit. Forgiveness becomes another burden, rather than a relief, something that must be proven rather than chosen, and because it cannot be proven in blood, it is dismissed as unreal. What emerges over time is a lineage that is spiritually overburdened and emotionally underdeveloped. They know how to endure, how to retaliate, how to justify, but not how to rest, rebuild, or renew. The curse creates experts in suffering and novices in living. When pain becomes the primary teacher, it produces graduates who know everything about loss and nothing about joy. There is a tragic irony in how fiercely the family clings to honor, because honor becomes the very thing that prevents healing. Honor demands consistency. Honor demands repayment. Honor demands that one act in accordance with precedent rather than conscience. The curse exploits honor's rigidity, transforming it from a moral compass into a cage. Acting honorably becomes indistinguishable from acting destructively. As the lineage approaches extinction, the curse's final achievement becomes clear. It has eliminated the possibility of mercy, not through prohibition, but through exhaustion. Mercy requires emotional surplus, enough inner space to absorb pain without returning it. The House of Atreus never has that surplus. Every generation is born already depleted, already behind, already owing. The curse ensures that no one ever has enough left to choose differently. The story's most unsettling implication is that the curse is not dramatic at its core. It is not thunderbolts or divine wrath. It is repetition. It is the quiet decision to do what has always been done because imagining anything else feels unbearable. The House of Atreus is destroyed not by extraordinary evil, but by ordinary responses to pain repeated without interruption. And when the family finally disappears, the world does not mourn them properly. Their suffering is absorbed into myth, into art, into cautionary tale. Their pain becomes instructive rather than personal. This transformation is itself a kind of final erasure. The individuals vanish completely, leaving behind only structure and symbol. The curse takes even their grief and repurposes it. What remains is a chilling question. The myth refuses to answer for us. If suffering can organize itself into identity, tradition, and morality, how does one dismantle it without dismantling the self? The House of Atreus never finds an answer. The story ends before such an answer can be attempted, and perhaps that is the final burden the myth places on us. It does not ask us to judge. Beyond even this, the curse reaches a point where it begins to hollow out the very concept of fey choice fey itself. The House of Atreus does not merely believe its actions are inevitable. It gradually loses the emotional capacity to experience alternatives as real. Possibility becomes abstract, theoretical, almost insulting. To suggest that things could be otherwise feels like denying the weight of everything that has already happened. Choice, in this world, feels like mockery, an idea invented by people who have not suffered enough to understand how heavy the past can be. And so the family moves forward, not because it wants to, but because stopping would require believing in a future that does not yet hurt. The curse also trains the family to mistake control for safety. Every act of vengeance, every calculated betrayal, every preemptive strike is an attempt to wrest order from chaos. If one can predict the next violence, plan it, execute it, then perhaps it will hurt less. Perhaps it will feel less like ambush and more like intention. This desire for control is deeply human, yet within the house of Atreus it becomes lethal. Control replaces trust, strategy replaces vulnerability. Life becomes something to manage rather than experience, and the tragedy is that the more tightly the family grips control, the more completely it is consumed by the very chaos it fears. There is also a terrible narrowing of empathy over time. Not because the family becomes crueler, but because empathy becomes unbearable. To fully feel another's pain would mean reopening wounds that never healed. It would mean acknowledging that everyone involved, including enemies, is acting from the same raw places of fear and loss, that recognition would dissolve the moral clarity the curse depends on. And so empathy is suppressed, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. The heart closes to survive, even as that closure ensures the cycle continues. The curse further reveals how easily ritual replaces reflection. Actions are repeated because they have always been repeated. Revenge follows murder because revenge has always followed murder. No one pauses long enough to ask whether the ritual still serves its purpose, or whether it ever did. Ritual provides structure, and structure provides comfort, even when the structure is destructive. In the house of Atreus, tradition becomes a machine that continues running long after its original meaning has been lost. As suffering compounds, the family also loses the ability to imagine forgiveness as something active and powerful. Forgiveness is misunderstood as forgetting, as weakness, as surrender. It is never seen as an act that requires strength, courage, and sacrifice of a different kind. Because forgiveness is passive in appearance, it is dismissed in favor of violence, which feels decisive and visible. The curse thrives on this misunderstanding, ensuring that only actions that cause harm are recognized as meaningful. There is a haunting absence of future-oriented language in the family's inner world. They speak constantly of what has been done and what must be answered, but rarely of what could be built. Creation is eclipsed by correction. Repair is eclipsed by retribution. The future exists only as a continuation of the past, never as a departure from it. And because nothing new is imagined, nothing new can be born. By the end, the house of Atreus does not collapse in a dramatic explosion. It withers. Its energy is spent not on living, but on maintaining balance sheets of pain. When life is reduced to accounting, joy has no place, love has no leverage, hope has no currency. The curse does not kill the family outright. It starves it of reasons to exist beyond obligation. What makes this ending so unsettling is that it offers no moral reassurance. There is no divine voice declaring the suffering meaningful, no cosmic balance restored, no final revelation that explains why it had to be this way. The universe does not apologize. It simply moves on, indifferent to how much was destroyed along the way. The silence that follows feels less like peace and more like abandonment. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of the curse. It promises meaning through suffering, but delivers only silence. It insists that pain must lead somewhere, that blood must buy resolution, that endurance must be rewarded, and then, when everything has been given, it offers nothing in return. The house of Atreus endures because it exposes a truth many myths avoid, that suffering does not automatically ennoble, that awareness does not guarantee change, and that justice pursued without mercy can become indistinguishable from cruelty. It shows how cycles persist, not because people love violence, but because they fear emptiness more than pain. The story ends without telling us how to break such a curse. It only shows us the cost of never trying. It leaves us with the burden the family could not carry, the responsibility to imagine a future that does not answer the past in kind, to honor memory without reenacting it, and to believe without proof that letting pain end does not make it meaningless. Until that belief is chosen, again and again, the house of Atreus does not remain safely sealed in myth. It continues wherever suffering becomes identity, wherever revenge feels like duty, and wherever the courage to stop feels more terrifying than the courage to continue. There is, at the deepest layer of the curse, a quiet theft of fey wonder fey. The house of Atreus lives in a world where nothing is allowed to surprise them gently. Surprise exists only as threat. The unexpected is not curiosity, but danger. This robs life of one of its most human qualities, the ability to be astonished without fear. Beauty does not interrupt their suffering, it only heightens their awareness of how fragile and temporary everything is. A peaceful moment is not savoured. It is counted down, measured by how soon it will be destroyed. The curse teaches them that nothing good is allowed to last, and so goodness becomes emotionally inaccessible even when it appears. This loss of wonder has devastating consequences. When nothing inspires awe, nothing invites humility. The world feels hostile rather than mysterious, mechanical rather than alive. The family does not ask "Fey we fey" in order to understand. They ask "Fey we fey" only to assign blame. Curiosity collapses into suspicion. Reverence collapses into fear. The curse flattens the emotional landscape until survival is the only remaining horizon. There is also a subtle cruelty in how the family is denied the right to be ordinary. Ordinary lives require the freedom to make small mistakes without catastrophic consequences. But in the house of Atreus, every mistake reverberates across generations. There are no minor choices, only fatal ones. This pressure crushes spontaneity. Life becomes a performance staged under relentless scrutiny, where every action must justify itself against an invisible tribunal of the dead. Existing becomes exhausting, not because of constant action, but because of constant consequence. The curse also reshapes how the family understands forgiveness. Forgiveness is seen not as an internal release, but as a public declaration that must be justified, defended, and accounted for. To forgive without permission, from ancestors, from gods, from memory itself, feels illicit. Forgiveness becomes another burden, rather than a relief, something that must be proven rather than chosen. And because it cannot be proven in blood, it is dismissed as unreal. What emerges over time is a lineage that is spiritually overburdened and emotionally underdeveloped. They know how to endure, how to retaliate, how to justify, but not how to rest, rebuild, or renew. The curse creates experts in suffering and novices in living. When pain becomes the primary teacher, it produces graduates who know everything about loss and nothing about joy. There is a tragic irony in how fiercely the family clings to honor, because honor becomes the very thing that prevents healing. Honor demands consistency. Honor demands repayment. Honor demands that one act in accordance with precedent rather than conscience. The curse exploits honor's rigidity, transforming it from a moral compass into a cage. Acting honorably becomes indistinguishable from acting destructively. As the lineage approaches extinction, The curse's final achievement becomes clear. It has eliminated the possibility of mercy, not through prohibition, but through exhaustion. Mercy requires emotional surplus, enough inner space to absorb pain without returning it. The House of Atreus never has that surplus. Every generation is born already depleted, already behind, already owing. The curse ensures that no one ever has enough left to choose differently. The story's most unsettling implication is that the curse is not dramatic at its core. It is not thunderbolts or divine wrath. It is repetition. It is the quiet decision to do what has always been done because imagining anything else feels unbearable. The House of Atreus is destroyed not by extraordinary evil, but by ordinary responses to pain repeated without interruption. And when the family finally disappears, the world does not mourn them properly. Their suffering is absorbed into myth, into art, into cautionary tale. Their pain becomes instructive rather than personal. This transformation is itself a kind of final erasure. The individuals vanish completely, leaving behind only structure and symbol. The curse takes even their grief and repurposes it. What remains is a chilling question. The myth refuses to answer for us. If suffering can organize itself into identity, tradition, and morality, how does one dismantle it without dismantling the self? The House of Atreus never finds an answer. The story ends before such an answer can be attempted, and perhaps that is the final burden the myth places on us. It does not ask us to judge. At the very edge of what the curse can consume lies its most devastating transformation. Suffering becomes invisible even to those who carry it. When pain is constant, it no longer announces itself. It hums beneath every thought, every gesture, every decision, so deeply embedded that it feels like personality rather than injury. The House of Atreus stops asking whether what they endure is abnormal, because abnormality requires comparison, and they have nothing else to compare it to. This normalization is not acceptance, it is captivity. The curse succeeds not by overwhelming its victims, but by convincing them that this is simply how life is meant to feel. Once pain is mistaken for nature, resistance becomes unthinkable. To resist would be to claim that another way of living exists, and that claim alone feels destabilizing. The family has organized its entire moral universe around survival within suffering. Remove the suffering, and the structure collapses. Roles lose meaning. Duties dissolve. Identity fractures. The curse thus binds the family not with fear alone, but with coherence. It offers a grim but stable framework in which everything, no matter how horrific, fits. Chaos is terrifying. Cursed order is familiar. This is why the House of Atreus repeatedly chooses what destroys it over what might free it. Freedom would require disorientation, grief without outlet, memory without command. It would require learning how to live without scripts written in blood. The curse persuades its victims that such freedom is a void rather than a possibility. Better to suffer with meaning than to live without explanation. Better to bleed than to be lost. Even love, when it appears, is reshaped by this logic. Love becomes possessive, fearful, and conditional. It exists not to nurture growth, but to secure loyalty. To love someone is to fear how they will be taken, how they will be used, how they will be turned into leverage in the next act of vengeance. The curse teaches the family to love as one guards a wound, tightly, defensively, with constant anxiety. Tenderness never relaxes, it clenches. the family's relationship with truth also deteriorates. Truth is no longer something to seek, but something to manage. Certain truths are emphasized because they justify action. Others are buried because they complicate it. Memory becomes selective not out of deception, but necessity. Too much truth would paralyze. Too little would feel dishonest. The curse thrives in this careful distortion, ensuring that what is remembered always points toward retaliation, never toward release. As the generations pass, the curse no longer needs dramatic crimes to sustain itself. Small acts are enough: suspicions, silences, refusals to speak plainly. Violence becomes implicit rather than explicit, carried in posture and tone, in the constant readiness for betrayal. Even when blood is not spilled, the logic of blood governs everything. This is the curse at its most efficient, invisible, ambient, unquestioned. By the time the lineage collapses, the tragedy is complete not because of how much was lost, but because nothing was transformed. Pain did not evolve into wisdom. Memory did not mature into understanding. Endurance did not become strength. Everything was consumed exactly as it was received. The curse ends not with insight, but with depletion so total that continuation is no longer possible. And in that ending, the myth offers its bleakest truth. Cycles do not always break because someone is brave enough to stop them. Sometimes they break only because there is nothing left to carry them forward. That is not victory. It is failure stretched across generations. The house of Atreus endures in the imagination because it refuses consolation. It does not tell us that suffering is redemptive, or that justice will eventually align with mercy. It tells us something far more unsettling, that without deliberate, conscious refusal, pain will always seek continuity. It will ask to be remembered, honored, justified, repeated. It will disguise itself as loyalty, as courage, as duty. And so the story leaves us standing where the family never could, at the threshold of choice. Not the choice to avenge or endure, but the choice to imagine meaning that does not depend on repayment. The myth does not promise that such a choice is easy or even survivable. It only shows what happens when it is never made. That is why the house of Atreus remains the most cursed family in Greek mythology, not because their gods were crueler or their crimes darker, but because their suffering was allowed to become a system that explained everything and healed nothing. A system so complete that escape felt like annihilation, and until humanity learns to honor the past without reenacting it, to remember pain without turning it into obligation, and to value mercy without demanding symmetry, that system remains alive, quiet, patient, waiting. At the furthest reach of the curse, something even more unsettling emerges. The family loses the ability to recognize innocence. Innocence is not denied or mocked, it is simply invisible. When one is born into a world where pain precedes memory, where betrayal is expected before trust, innocence has no reference point. It is not that the house of Atreus destroys innocence deliberately. It never learns how to see it in the first place. Children are not viewed as beginnings, but as futures already burdened. Their lives are read forward instead of allowed to unfold. In this way, the curse robs life of its most radical power, the power to begin again. This inability to perceive beginnings ensures that every act is interpreted through the lens of endings. Conversations are weighed for their consequences. Affection is measured for how it might be exploited. Silence is feared for what it might conceal. Nothing is allowed to exist simply as itself. Meaning is always deferred, always instrumental, always tied to what must come next. The present is never enough, and because the present is never honoured, it can never heal. There is also a profound violence in how the family relates to truth. Truth is not something that frees, it is something that condemns. To know the truth is to inherit obligation. Revelation does not bring clarity, it brings command. When a hidden crime is revealed, it does not lead to reconciliation, only to escalation. The curse teaches that knowing more does not make one wiser. It makes one more responsible for blood yet to be spilled. Ignorance is not innocence, but knowledge is not salvation either. Both are traps. Over generations, the family begins to live as if moral balance were a physical law, like gravity, automatic, impersonal and unforgiving. If something terrible happens, something terrible must be done in response. No one stops to ask whether this law is real or constructed, because questioning it feels as futile as questioning gravity itself. The curse embeds itself so deeply that it masquerades as reality. Violence is not chosen, it is obeyed. And yet beneath all this inevitability, there is a quiet grief that never fully hardens into cruelty. It lingers like a bruise that never fades. The family mourns, but without ritual that can contain mourning. They grieve, but without language that can transform grief into remembrance rather than command. This unresolved sorrow seeps into everything, turning even acts of vengeance into expressions of loss rather than triumph. No one ever feels satisfied. No victory feels complete. The curse denies even the grim pleasure of revenge by ensuring that it never truly resolves anything. What makes the House of Atreus unbearable is that it shows how easily humans can confuse suffering with depth. Pain becomes proof of seriousness, of moral weight, of importance. A life without suffering begins to look shallow by comparison. The curse whispers that if something does not hurt, it does not matter. Joy becomes suspect. Simplicity feels dishonest. Peace feels undeserved. This aestheticization of suffering ensures that even when pain could be relinquished, it is clung to as evidence that one's life has meaning. As the lineage approaches its end, the tragedy is no longer loud. It is muted, drained, almost colourless. Violence continues, but without fury. Decisions are made, but without conviction. Everyone involved seems to be moving through motions whose original purpose has been forgotten. This is the curse's final victory. It reduces life to ritual without belief, action without hope, memory without warmth. Nothing remains except continuation for its own sake. And when that continuation finally fails, when there is no one left willing or able to carry the weight forward, the story does not close with insight. It simply stops. The silence that follows is not meaningful silence. It does not feel sacred or earned. It feels like abandonment, as though the universe, having allowed the cycle to run unchecked for so long, simply turned away once it was finished, consuming its subjects. This is why the House of Atreus feels less like a myth and more like a diagnosis. It identifies a condition that does not belong to ancient Greece alone, the transformation of pain into identity, memory into obligation, justice into repetition. It shows how suffering, when left uninterrogated, does not fade. It organizes, it builds systems, it teaches, it reproduces itself. The story leaves no comfort behind. only a responsibility that the family itself never managed to claim. It asks whether remembrance must always demand reenactment, whether loyalty to the dead must always cost the living, and whether meaning must always be purchased with pain. The house of Atreus could not involve blood. That failure is what destroyed it. And that is why the curse does not truly belong to the gods, or to fate, or even to the family alone. It belongs to any world. There is a final, almost unbearable irony in the curse of the house of Atreus. It teaches the family to believe that stopping would be an act of cowardice, to endure pain, to retaliate, to carry the weight forward. These are framed as virtues. To refuse, to forgive, to let the story end. These are framed as weakness, even betrayal. The curse rewrites moral courage so thoroughly that the bravest act imaginable, choosing not to continue, becomes unthinkable. Strength is measured by how much suffering one can absorb and return, not by the ability to transform it. In this way, the curse functions like a moral inversion. What should heal becomes dangerous. What should destroy becomes sacred. The family's internal compass spins endlessly, pointing toward retaliation as the only reliable direction. Even exhaustion is moralized. To be tired is not a signal to stop, but proof of righteousness. Evidence that one has paid dearly and is therefore entitled to demand payment in return. The curse rewards endurance without reflection, perseverance without purpose. The house of Atreus also reveals how trauma can fossilize values. What may once have been adaptive, defending oneself, remembering the dead, insisting on accountability, becomes rigid over time. Flexibility disappears. Context vanishes. The same response is applied to every situation, regardless of cost. This rigidity gives the curse its longevity. It does not adapt. It enforces sameness. Change is perceived not as growth, but as abandonment. Perhaps the most devastating realization is that no one in the family ever truly chooses the curse, yet no one chooses to end it either. The curse persists in the narrow space between these two absences of choice. It survives because it feels inherited rather than imposed, familiar rather than foreign. It feels like how things are, not like something that could be dismantled. This is why the myth feels so modern, so psychologically precise. It understands that the most powerful systems are not those enforced by force, but those accepted as natural. The story also exposes how easily suffering becomes competitive. Pain is compared, weighed, ranked. Whoever has suffered most feels most justified in acting. This creates an endless escalation, because suffering always has a deeper past, a longer memory, a more grievous origin. There is no final authority capable of declaring the debt paid. The curse ensures that someone can always claim precedence in pain, and therefore precedence in violence. As this competition intensifies, compassion becomes impossible. Not because it is absent, but because it feels unfair. To show mercy to one party feels like betrayal of another. The family is paralyzed by the belief that kindness must be evenly distributed. And since suffering can never be evenly balanced, kindness is withheld altogether. The curse thus transforms fairness into cruelty, turning ethical concern into justification for inaction or brutality. The house of Atreus ultimately collapses under the weight of its own moral bookkeeping. There are too many debts, too many accounts, too many unresolved claims. the system becomes unmanageable. Yet instead of abandoning the system, the family sacrifices itself to it. This is the final cruelty of the curse. It convinces its victims that the system matters more than the people trapped inside it. When silence finally falls, it is not the silence of peace, but the silence of something that has been used up. The story does not end because the lesson is learned, but because there is no one left to carry it forward. This ending refuses transcendence. It denies the audience the comfort of believing that suffering is always meaningful. Instead, it suggests that suffering can be vast, prolonged, and utterly unredeemed. And yet, the myth does something remarkable in its refusal to console. It hands the burden of choice to the listener. If the house of Atreus could not imagine a future unshackled from the past, perhaps we can. If they could not release pain without repaying it, perhaps we can learn to do so. The story does not show us how to break the cycle, but it shows us the cost of refusing to try. That is why the house of Atreus remains the most cursed family in Greek mythology. Not because their crimes were the bloodiest, but because their logic was the most complete. The curse did not merely punish them. It explained the world to them, taught them how to think, how to feel, how to justify. It became their truth. And truths once inherited are far harder to escape than chains. The myth leaves us not with answers, but with responsibility. It asks whether memory must always demand blood, whether justice must always mimic harm, and whether loyalty to the past must always cost the future. The house of Atreus could not answer these questions differently. That is why it fell. Whether the curse ends there, or continues under new names, in new forms, depends not on the gods, but on those who hear the story and decide what to do with its warning. There is also a haunting sense that the curse teaches the family to fear Fey Rest Fey. Rest implies safety, and safety implies trust, both of which feel dangerous to those shaped by relentless loss. To rest would mean lowering one's guard, allowing vulnerability, risking surprise. The house of Atreus learns instead to live in permanent readiness, braced for impact even in moments of apparent calm. This constant tension becomes normal, shaping not just behavior but perception itself. The world is read as hostile by default. Every silence is suspect. Every kindness is provisional. The curse ensures that even peace, when it briefly appears, is interpreted as the prelude to catastrophe. This permanent alertness corrodes the soul. When one is never allowed to relax, the self becomes brittle, incapable of absorbing anything gently. Emotion arrives only in extremes, rage or numbness, despair or grim resolve. Subtlety disappears. Nuance becomes unbearable. The curse thrives in this environment because it simplifies existence into survival and retaliation, stripping life of its quieter meanings. Beauty, curiosity, play, these have no place in a lineage that has learned to equate stillness with danger. There is also a profound distortion of time at work. The family does not experience time as flow, but as pressure. The past presses forward relentlessly, the future presses backward with dread, and the present collapses into a narrow corridor where reaction is the only possible movement. There is no spaciousness in which to reflect or choose. Every moment feels urgent, overdetermined, already compromised. The curse survives by eliminating pause, because pause is where reconsideration might occur. The myth also reveals how inherited suffering reshapes moral thresholds. Acts that would horrify outsiders feel inevitable, even restrained to those inside the curse. This is not because the family lacks conscience, but because conscience has been recalibrated to a world where extremes are normal. When everything is catastrophic, nothing feels exceptional. The curse does not erase morality, it overwhelms it. Right and wrong blur, not through confusion, but through saturation. What is particularly devastating is that the family's longing for absolution never disappears. They want release. They want forgiveness. They want the weight to lift, but they seek these things through the only language they know: violence, balance, repayment. Because they cannot imagine mercy as a force strong enough to carry meaning, they never try it. The curse does not extinguish hope. It misdirects it. Over time, the family begins to confuse inevitability with truth. Because the cycle has always continued, they assume it must continue. Longevity is mistaken for correctness. Duration becomes validation. This is one of the most insidious mechanisms of the curse. It uses time itself as evidence. The longer suffering persists, the more natural it feels. And what feels natural is rarely questioned. There is also a terrible loneliness in realizing that the family is unable to ask for help. To ask would be to admit uncertainty, and uncertainty threatens the fragile structure holding everything together. Pride, shame, and fear combine to isolate the lineage from any external intervention that might disrupt the cycle. The curse feeds on this isolation, sealing the family into a closed system where nothing new can enter and nothing old can leave. As the myth draws toward its end, the emotional cost becomes almost unbearable. The family is exhausted, yet unable to stop, wounded, yet unable to heal, aware, yet unable to change. This paralysis is the curse's final form, not explosive destruction, but immobilization. Movement continues only because stopping feels worse. And when silence finally arrives, it is not the silence of peace earned, but the silence of breath held too long, and finally released because there is no strength left to hold it. The world continues, but the family does not. Their disappearance is not a resolution, it is an absence. A gap where something should have been transformed, but instead was simply worn away. The story leaves us with an unsettling responsibility. It does not show us heroes who break the cycle, nor villains who deserve their fate. It shows us people trapped inside a logic that feels reasonable until it destroys everything. The House of Atreus becomes a warning not about gods or destiny, but about what happens when pain is allowed to define meaning, and when the past is given authority over the future. The curse, in the end, is not a spell. It is a pattern, and patterns survive because they are repeated, not because they are enforced. The myth asks us, quietly and relentlessly, whether we recognize that pattern in ourselves, in families, in societies, in histories that refuse to let go. It asks whether we believe suffering must always be answered. There is a quiet terror in realizing that the curse also trains the family to confuse memory with obligation. Remembering the dead does not mean honoring their lives. It means reenacting their deaths. Memory becomes prescriptive rather than reflective. The past is not something to learn from, but something to obey. To forget would be betrayal, to forgive would be erasure. And so remembrance becomes another instrument of violence, a way of keeping wounds open, so they can continue to justify harm. The family does not mourn in order to heal. It mourns in order to continue. This distortion of memory creates a world where nothing is allowed to end naturally. Grief is never completed. Anger is never exhausted. Loss is never integrated. Each emotion is frozen at its most destructive intensity and preserved across generations like an inheritance too sacred to question. Emotional growth becomes impossible because growth would require release, and release would threaten the logic of the curse. The house of Atreus is emotionally static, trapped in a permanent state of unfinished reaction. There is also a profound spiritual starvation that runs through the family. Rituals exist, sacrifices are made, gods are invoked, but none of it nourishes the soul. Religion becomes transactional rather than transformative. The divine is not a source of comfort or wisdom, but another authority demanding payment. Even when the gods intervene to resolve conflicts, their solutions feel administrative rather than compassionate, as though suffering has been managed rather than healed. The family learns that the sacred offers no refuge, only regulation. This absence of sanctuary is devastating. There is nowhere to rest, not in home, not in family, not in faith. Every space is compromised. The palace is a site of murder. The family is a site of betrayal. The divine is a site of contradiction. Without refuge, endurance becomes the only remaining virtue. The curse rewards those who can carry the most weight without collapsing, even as that weight crushes everything meaningful. The family's tragedy also reveals how violence narrows ethical imagination until survival itself becomes suspect. To survive is to continue the line, and to continue the line is to continue the curse. Life becomes morally ambiguous. Existence feels complicit. This creates an undercurrent of self-loathing that seeps into every action. Characters do not simply hate others. They hate themselves for being what they are, for carrying a name soaked in blood. Identity becomes something to endure rather than embrace. What is most heartbreaking is that the family never experiences ordinary happiness. There are no small joys untainted by anticipation or regret. Even love is overshadowed by calculation. How long will this last, and how will it be destroyed? Pleasure feels dangerous, as though it tempts fate. Contentment feels irresponsible, as though it ignores debts that must still be paid. The curse teaches the family to distrust joy, to see it as a prelude to punishment rather than a value in itself. As the cycle drags on, the distinction between cause and effect dissolves. It becomes impossible to identify where the curse truly began, because every act is both response and provocation. Blame loses meaning when everyone is simultaneously victim and perpetrator. This moral fog is not accidental. It is the environment in which the curse thrives. When accountability becomes diffuse, nothing can be corrected. Responsibility floats, unattached, unable to land anywhere long enough to change behavior. The final devastation of the house of Atreus is not spectacle, but erosion. What disappears first is innocence, then trust, then hope. Finally, meaning itself begins to dissolve. Actions continue, but their significance thins until they feel ritualistic rather than purposeful. Violence persists not because it promises resolution, but because stopping feels emptier than continuing. When a family reaches this stage, destruction no longer needs motivation. Momentum is enough, and when the story finally falls silent, the silence does not feel earned. It feels accidental, as though the cycle did not resolve but simply ran out of participants. This is perhaps the cruelest ending imaginable. Not redemption, not justice, but depletion. The curse ends not because it is defeated, but because there is nothing left for it to consume. In that ending lies the final warning of the myth. It does not promise that suffering will teach wisdom, or that time will heal wounds, or that awareness will lead to change. It suggests instead that cycles of harm persist precisely because they feel meaningful to those trapped inside them. They provide structure where chaos threatens, identity where uncertainty looms, and explanation where pain feels unbearable. Breaking such a cycle requires not strength alone, but a willingness to live without the guarantees that pain provides. The House of Atreus is therefore not simply the most cursed family in Greek mythology. It is the most honest. It strips away comforting illusions about justice, fate, and moral balance, exposing how easily suffering becomes tradition, and how hard it is to imagine mercy without precedent. Its story endures because it does not reassure, it accuses. It asks whether humanity is capable of honouring the past without being enslaved by it, of remembering without repeating, of carrying pain without turning it into purpose. And until those questions are answered, not in myth, but in life, the curse of the House of Atreus does not truly belong to the ancient world. It remains present wherever memory demands blood, wherever suffering becomes identity, and wherever the past is allowed to rule the future without challenge. There is something almost unbearable in how the curse teaches the family to mistake continuity for meaning. As long as the story continues, as long as someone is still alive to remember and respond, the suffering feels justified. Ending the cycle feels like erasing oneself, like admitting that generations of pain amounted to nothing. And so the House of Atreus clings to continuation, not because it brings hope, but because it prevents the terrifying possibility that all the bloodshed was purposeless. The curse survives by exploiting this fear of meaninglessness, whispering that suffering must be preserved in order to remain significant. This creates a world in which endings are more frightening than beginnings. Closure threatens to expose the emptiness beneath the violence. If revenge does not restore what was lost, if justice does not heal the wound, then what was the point of enduring it all? The family avoids this question by never allowing the cycle to stop. Action replaces reflection. Retaliation replaces reckoning. The curse thrives not on hatred alone, but on avoidance. The refusal to sit with grief long enough to realize that no amount of blood will make it whole again. The tragedy deepens when we see how completely the family's emotional inheritance crowds out individuality. Members of the House of Atreus are never allowed to be simply themselves. They are sons of crimes, daughters of vengeance, heirs of obligations that existed before their first breath. Personal desire is treated as indulgence. Private dreams are swallowed by public destiny. To want something unrelated to the past feels irresponsible, even immoral. The curse enforces conformity, not through force, but through shame. The shame of imagining a life untouched by ancestral suffering. Over time, the family loses the ability to distinguish between remembrance and repetition. Honoring the dead becomes indistinguishable from recreating their pain. The past is kept alive, not through stories of who people were, but through reenactments of how they died. This transforms memory into a command rather than a reflection. The dead do not inspire wisdom, they demand action, and because the dead can never be satisfied, the living are condemned to perpetual inadequacy, always failing to repay what can never truly be repaid. There is also a profound erosion of moral scale. When atrocities become frequent, they stop feeling extraordinary. Horror becomes background noise. The emotional threshold for shock rises so high that only extreme acts register as meaningful. This escalation traps the family in a grim arms race against its own numbness, requiring ever greater violence to feel that something has been done. The curse does not merely encourage brutality, it inflates it, demanding more and more just to maintain the illusion of moral movement. What makes the house of Atreus especially devastating is that tenderness never fully disappears. It is simply never allowed to survive. Moments of softness appear like brief flickers, a hesitation before a blow, a tear shed in private, a longing for a life that could have been. But these moments are treated as dangerous weaknesses, quickly suppressed or punished. The curse cannot tolerate gentleness, because gentleness threatens to interrupt the cycle. Compassion is not crushed because it is absent, but because it is present and therefore must be destroyed. As generations pass, the family's relationship to choice becomes increasingly distorted. Choice exists, but it feels unreal, hypothetical, almost insulting. Being told one could choose differently feels like mockery in a world where every alternative seems to carry unbearable consequences. The curse reframes coercion as inevitability, making constraint feel natural and freedom feel absurd. Over time, this internalized limitation becomes so complete that even imagining resistance feels futile. The most effective prison is one whose walls are no longer perceived. The end of the House of Atreus does not arrive with revelation or forgiveness, but with depletion of possibility. There is nothing left to avenge, no one left to punish, no future left to shape. At some point, the curse becomes indistinguishable from atmosphere. It is no longer an event or a sequence of punishments, but the background condition of existence itself. For the House of Atreus, waking up each day already means standing inside a moral storm that began long before them and will continue long after. This is why their choices feel constrained, even when no God is actively speaking and no prophecy is being uttered. The curse has been internalized. It lives in instinct, in reflex, in the way fear precedes thought. Violence does not need to be commanded anymore. It is anticipated, rehearsed, prepared for as one prepares for winter or famine. This internalization of the curse is perhaps its most lethal evolution. Once suffering becomes self-sustaining, it no longer requires an external enforcer. No divine punishment is necessary when expectation alone is enough to shape behavior. The family learns to police itself, to correct deviations, to return anyone who hesitates back to the familiar logic of retaliation. Doubt is treated as weakness, hesitation as danger, even silence becomes suspect. In such an environment, the most radical act imaginable is not rebellion, but restraint. What is striking is how completely imagination is disciplined by pain. The House of Atreus does not lack intelligence, eloquence, or awareness. What it lacks is permission to envision a future that does not resemble the past. The curse functions like an invisible wall around thought itself. Anything beyond it feels unreal, impractical, naive. Peace is not rejected because it is undesirable, but because it feels impossible to sustain. The family does not believe the world will allow gentleness to survive, and so they preemptively harden themselves, choosing brutality as a form of self-defense against a reality they assume is merciless. There is also a profound erosion of trust in goodness. Even when offered mercy, it is suspected to be a trap. Kindness is interpreted as manipulation. Forgiveness is viewed as delayed violence. This suspicion poisons every potential exit from the cycle. Opportunities for peace arrive, but they cannot be recognized as such. The curse has trained its victims to read threat where none exists, to anticipate betrayal even in sincerity. In this way, the family sabotages its own escape routes, not out of malice, but out of learnt fear. The tragedy deepens when we realize that the curse does not spare moments of reflection. Insight arrives, but always too late, always after damage has already been done. Regret blooms only once it can no longer change anything. This delayed awareness adds another layer of clarity, without remedy. Characters understand the horror of what they have done at precisely the moment when undoing it is impossible. Knowledge becomes another form of punishment rather than liberation. Over generations, the emotional cost of this existence becomes unbearable, yet strangely normalized. The family grows accustomed to living at the edge of collapse. Stability itself feels alien. Calm is experienced as anticipation rather than relief, a quiet that signals impending disaster. This constant vigilance erodes the nervous system of the lineage, leaving behind characters who are hyper, aware, perpetually braced for impact, incapable of rest. The curse does not allow peace even when violence pauses. It ensures that fear continues the work of destruction during moments of stillness. By the time the story nears its end, what is most devastating is not the scale of the violence, but the emptiness it leaves behind. The curse consumes meaning faster than it produces it. Actions lose resonance. Death loses weight. The moral universe flattens until nothing feels sacred anymore. When everything has been violated, violation itself ceases to shock. This spiritual exhaustion is the final victory of the curse. It does not just kill bodies, it hollows out values, leaving behind a world where nothing feels worth protecting, except the cycle itself. And yet, the myth never allows us to dismiss the family as irredeemable monsters. Their humanity persists stubbornly, painfully, in the margins. It appears in hesitation, in grief, in moments of self-loathing, in the recognition that something has gone terribly wrong. These moments make the curse more tragic, not less, because they show that another path was always faintly visible, always just beyond reach. The house of Atreus is not destroyed because its members lack conscience, but because conscience alone cannot overpower an entire inherited worldview. In the final analysis, the curse reveals a devastating truth about human systems. When suffering becomes identity, ending it feels like self-annihilation. The family clings to its pain because it is the only stable thing it has ever known. Letting go would mean stepping into a void without guarantees, without scripts, without ancestral approval. The myth suggests that such a leap requires a courage rarer than heroism, the courage to be unrecognizable to one's own past. And so the house of Atreus fades not with redemption, but with a warning that lingers far beyond the story itself. It warns that cycles of harm do not survive because they are enforced by gods, but because they are defended by fear, habit, and the longing for meaning in suffering. It warns that justice without mercy calcifies into cruelty, that memory without forgiveness becomes a weapon, and that endurance without imagination becomes a prison. The curse does not end in fire or revelation. It ends in silence, heavy, with everything that was never healed. And in that silence, the myth asks its final, most unsettling question. Not whether the house of Atreus was doomed, but whether any lineage, any society, any human story can truly escape the same fate, unless someone is willing to break the cycle without knowing what will replace it. There is an almost unbearable sadness in realizing that the curse ultimately teaches the family to fear peace more than pain. Pain is familiar. It has texture, history, and rules. Peace, by contrast, is undefined. It asks questions the house of Atreus has never learned how to answer. Who are we without our enemies? What do we owe the dead, if not blood? How do we live when there is nothing left to avenge? The curse convinces its victims that these questions are traps, that peace is a fragile illusion waiting to be shattered, and that investing hope in it is foolish. And so the family remains loyal to suffering, not because it is meaningful, but because it is predictable. The myth also reveals how easily moral responsibility can be outsourced to forces beyond oneself. Fate, gods, prophecy, ancestry, all become convenient vessels into which guilt is poured. By attributing violence to inevitability, the family preserves a sense of internal coherence. They are not monsters, they are instruments. They are not choosing cruelty. They are fulfilling a design. This abdication of responsibility is subtle and seductive, because it allows individuals to commit acts they would otherwise find unbearable, while still seeing themselves as righteous. The curse flourishes in this moral outsourcing, growing stronger every time agency is surrendered in the name of destiny. There is something deeply tragic in how the family's longing for justice mutates into obsession. Justice, stripped of compassion and context, becomes mechanical, an equation that must always balance, no matter the human cost. The House of Atreus does not seek fairness. It seeks symmetry. For every wound, a wound. For every death, a death. This arithmetic approach to morality feels orderly, even rational, but it ignores the reality that suffering does not cancel out suffering. It accumulates. The myth exposes the lie at the heart of retributive thinking, that harm can be undone by replication. As generations pass, the family's emotional capacity continues to shrink. Grief is compressed into anger. Love is compressed into loyalty. Fear is compressed into aggression. Complex feelings are reduced to single responses that can be acted upon quickly and decisively. This simplification makes survival easier in the short term, but devastating in the long term. The curse thrives on emotional compression because it eliminates ambiguity, and ambiguity is where alternatives live. When feelings are flattened, choices disappear. The House of Atreus also demonstrates how trauma rewrites moral instincts at a biological level. Violence stops being shocking because the nervous system adapts to constant threat. Hypervigilance replaces curiosity. Suspicion replaces openness. Even kindness triggers anxiety, because it does not fit the learned pattern of the world. The curse embeds itself so deeply that even if external circumstances were to change, the internal landscape would remain hostile. The family is no longer just face en fay a cursed world. They fay the cursed world. Perhaps the most devastating implication of the myth is that the curse does not require belief to function. Even when characters doubt prophecy, resent the gods, or despise their inheritance, they still act in accordance with it. The curse has moved beyond ideology and into structure. It shapes incentives, rewards, punishments. It determines which actions feel possible and which feel absurd. By the time anyone questions it, questioning itself feels like an indulgence they cannot afford. Survival demands compliance. The final tragedy is not simply that the family destroys itself, but that it never experiences release. There is no moment where suffering is redeemed by understanding, no point at which the weight lifts and meaning crystallizes. The myth refuses transcendence. It offers no assurance that the pain was necessary, no revelation that justifies the cost. The silence at the end is not sacred, it is hollow. The universe does not explain itself, it simply moves on. And that refusal is what gives the story. There is also an eerie sense in which the curse teaches the family to confuse destruction with resolution. Each act of violence promises an ending, a final settling of accounts, yet never delivers it. Instead, it creates a temporary illusion of control, a momentary feeling that chaos has been shaped into meaning. This illusion is addictive. It offers relief, not because it heals, but because it simplifies. Complex grief becomes a single target. Moral confusion becomes a single command. The curse survives by offering clarity at the cost of humanity, reducing unbearable emotional complexity into the false comfort of decisive cruelty. Over time, the family loses the ability to imagine a future that is not reactive. Plans are always responses, never creations. Life becomes backward, facing oriented toward what must be answered, rather than what might be built. This backward gaze traps them in perpetual aftermath, living in the shadow of events that can no longer be changed. Hope requires forward imagination, and imagination withers under the weight of constant reckoning. The curse does not merely destroy bodies, it erodes the capacity to dream. The emotional inheritance of the House of Atreus is especially cruel because it is transmitted without consent. Each generation is born already burdened, already implicated, already judged by crimes they did not commit. Innocence becomes irrelevant. Moral accounting begins at birth. This creates a profound injustice at the heart of the curse. Punishment precedes action. Suffering is not a consequence of choice, but a condition of existence. In such a world, ethics lose their grounding, because responsibility is detached from agency. One is guilty, not because one has acted, but because one exists. This existential weight transforms even survival into an act of violence. To live on is to carry the curse forward, to extend the lineage of pain. Survival becomes morally ambiguous, haunted by the knowledge that existence itself perpetuates the cycle. Death, by contrast, can appear as release, not only from suffering, but from responsibility. This inversion of values is one of the most disturbing outcomes of the curse. Life is tainted, death is simplified. When a family reaches this point, destruction no longer feels tragic, it feels logical. The myth also exposes how easily sacred authority can be weaponized against the vulnerable. Gods demand sacrifices, prophecies dictate bloodshed, and divine endorsement legitimizes acts that would otherwise be unthinkable. The House of Atreus becomes proof that moral systems collapse when power is separated from accountability. Those who issue commands never bear their consequences. Those who obey are crushed beneath them. The curse thrives in this imbalance, exploiting the gap between authority and suffering. What ultimately makes the House of Atreus unbearable to witness is that its members are not ignorant of their own ruin. They sense it, they speak of it, they anticipate it. Yet anticipation does not prevent repetition. Awareness without agency becomes another form of torment, turning insight into despair. Knowing that one is cursed does not free one from the curse. It deepens it, because it strips away the comfort of ignorance, while offering no alternative path. As the family line collapses, what remains is not resolution, but residue. Trauma does not vanish with the last act of violence. It lingers as atmosphere, shaping the moral universe long after the characters themselves are gone. The myth suggests that endings are rarely clean. Cycles do not conclude neatly. They decay, leaving behind patterns that can re-emerge elsewhere under new names. The house of Atreus may fall, but the logic that destroyed it survives. In its final, most unsettling implication, the story refuses to isolate evil within a single family. Instead, it hints that the house of Atreus is an extreme concentration of tendencies present everywhere. Revenge mistaken for justice, endurance mistaken for strength, suffering mistaken for meaning. The curse feels supernatural only because its human foundations are so familiar. Greek mythology does not present this family as an anomaly, but as a warning magnified to unbearable clarity. And so the story does not truly end. It lingers, heavy and unresolved, insisting that the most dangerous curses are not those cast by gods, but those taught quietly across generations. When pain becomes inheritance, when violence becomes tradition, and when morality becomes accounting rather than compassion, the house of Atreus ceases to be ancient history. It becomes a mirror, one that reflects what happens when humanity mistakes repetition for destiny and refuses, again and again, to imagine a different way forward. At the deepest level, the curse transforms time into a prison. For the house of Atreus, the future is never open. It is always already contaminated by what has come before. Anticipation becomes dread rather than hope. Birth is not a beginning, but a reminder that the cycle has not yet finished consuming itself. Every new life represents not possibility, but continuation. This inversion of time is essential to the curse's power. When the future is perceived only as repetition, change becomes unimaginable. People do not fight for what they cannot picture, and the family cannot picture a life untouched by blood. The emotional vocabulary of the family grows thinner with each generation. Early crimes are fueled by passion, anger, jealousy, humiliation, but later acts are colder, quieter, and more procedural. Violence loses its emotional heat and becomes almost ceremonial. Killing is performed not in a frenzy, but with grim acceptance, as if it were simply another task required by the order of things. This emotional flattening is one of the most frightening consequences of the curse. It shows how prolonged trauma does not always produce chaos. Sometimes it produces calm, a numb stability built on horror. The curse also dismantles the boundary between the personal and the cosmic. Private grief becomes entangled with divine will, and individual suffering is elevated into a matter of universal order. This inflation makes the pain feel unavoidable, even sacred. When suffering is framed as cosmically meaningful, resisting it can feel like defiance against the structure of reality itself. The house of Atreus becomes trapped not just by events, but by interpretation. Their story is constantly being told fey about fey them, by gods, by prophecy, by tradition, until they themselves become secondary to the narrative that encloses them. They live inside a story that demands sacrifice, and the story always wins. What is particularly tragic is that compassion does appear within the family, but only in fleeting, fragile moments that are quickly crushed. There are pauses, hesitations before action, moments of doubt, glimpses of tenderness that suggest the curse is not absolute. Yet these moments are never allowed to mature. They are interrupted by obligation, fear, or external command. Compassion is treated as dangerous because it threatens the logic that holds everything together. To spare an enemy, to forgive a wrong, would destabilize the entire moral economy of the family. Mercy is not just risky, it is revolutionary, and revolutions are precisely what the curse is designed to prevent. As a result, suffering becomes self-validating. The more the family endures, the more justified they feel in continuing. Pain becomes proof of righteousness. The logic is circular and airtight. We suffer because we are cursed. We are cursed because we suffer. There is no external standard by which to measure goodness or harm, only accumulation. Whoever has suffered most feels entitled to act most violently. This turns the family into a closed moral loop, immune to correction, incapable of learning. The ultimate cruelty of the curse is that it offers meaning but denies fulfillment. It explains everything while fixing nothing. Members of the House of Atreus always know fey things are happening, but that knowledge never helps them escape. Explanation replaces healing. Understanding replaces change. The myth suggests that explanation alone is not salvation. Sometimes it is a trap, convincing people that comprehension is enough, that naming a cycle is the same as breaking it. When the line finally withers, it does not feel like justice has been served. It feels like something has simply run out. Energy, bodies, patience, will. The curse ends not with redemption, but with silence. And that silence is heavy, unresolved, morally ambiguous. It does not reassure us that the suffering was necessary or meaningful. It only confirms that destruction, once normalized, consumes everything eventually, including itself. This is why the House of Atreus remains so haunting. It does not comfort. It does not resolve. It does not allow distance. Instead, it insists that cycles of harm are sustained not by monsters or fate alone, but by ordinary human responses to pain, fear, loyalty, justification, exhaustion. The curse survives because it feels reasonable from the inside. It survives because each step forward seems smaller than the cost of stopping. And in that final realization lies the true horror of the myth, that the most cursed family in Greek mythology is not defined by a single crime or divine punishment, but by an inability to imagine mercy as stronger than revenge. As long as suffering is treated as debt, as long as violence is treated as payment, and as long as history is treated as obligation rather than warning, the House of Atreus does not remain confined to myth. It reappears wherever pain is inherited, instead of healed, wherever retaliation replaces responsibility, and wherever the past is allowed to dictate the future without challenge. There is finally a sense that the curse erases the boundary between living and dead until the family exists in a kind of haunted continuity. What lingers after everything else is a sense that the curse does not merely afflict individuals, but actively reshapes the meaning of life within the family, reducing existence to a sequence of moral debts that can never be fully repaid. Every breath taken by a member of the House of Atreus seems borrowed, as if life itself is provisional, granted only until the next demand for blood is made. Happiness, when it appears, feels temporary and suspicious, a calm that exists only to make the next catastrophe sharper. Joy is never trusted. Love is never safe. Even victory carries the taste of ash, because triumph always implies that someone else has been destroyed to make it possible. The family story suggests that once violence becomes normalized, it begins to masquerade as tradition. Children grow up not questioning the logic of revenge, but memorizing it. They inherit not wisdom, but scripts, narratives that tell them who they must become and whom they must destroy. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the curse. It educates its victims. It teaches them how to hate, how to justify, how to endure. By the time a member of the House of Atreus is old enough to choose, the choices have already been narrowed to two unbearable options, both of which perpetuate the cycle. Freedom exists only as an abstract concept, never as a lived reality. There is also a haunting sense that the family is being watched, not only by gods, but by history itself. Their suffering becomes spectacle, retold and reenacted, as if their pain has been transformed into a lesson for others. Yet within the story, this awareness offers no comfort. Being remembered does not redeem them, it freezes them forever at the moment of their worst acts. Their legacy is not wisdom, but warning. They do not pass down knowledge of how to live well, only evidence of how badly things can go when violence is allowed to define moral order. The curse ultimately exposes the fragility of human systems of meaning. Concepts like justice, duty, piety, and honor collapse under the weight of repeated bloodshed, revealing how easily they can be bent to serve cruelty. The House of Atreus becomes a case study in how moral frameworks fail when they prioritize balance over compassion and retribution over healing. Every attempt to restore equilibrium through violence only destabilizes the world further, proving that symmetry in suffering does not create peace, it multiplies harm. Even when the family's line finally thins and the immediate cycle of vengeance loses momentum, there is no sense of triumph. The silence that follows is not peaceful, it is empty. Too much has been lost for resolution to feel meaningful. The myth does not offer closure so much as cessation, as if the universe simply grows tired of the carnage and allows it to fade rather than be resolved. This ending reinforces the idea that some damage cannot be undone, only outlived. In the final impression left by the House of Atreus, the curse feels less like an external force and more like a mirror held up to humanity's darkest tendencies. It asks whether suffering inevitably reproduces itself when left unexamined, whether violence becomes tradition when no one dares to imagine a different response, and whether justice without mercy is indistinguishable from cruelty. The family's destruction serves as a bleak reminder that cycles do not break themselves. They persist until someone is willing to absorb pain without returning it, to endure injustice without weaponizing it, to accept loss without demanding repayment. Greek mythology suggests that such an act may be almost impossible, but it also implies that without it, the curse never truly ends. As the story stretches toward its emotional horizon, the most unsettling realization is that the curse does not require hatred to survive anymore. By the final generations, hatred has burned itself out, replaced by obligation and numb endurance. The members of the House of Atreus do not always act because they are consumed by rage. They act because they cannot imagine Fey not Fey acting. Violence becomes routine, almost bureaucratic, stripped of passion yet still devastating. This is the stage at which the curse is most powerful, when horror no longer shocks, when bloodshed is expected rather than feared. At that point, morality does not collapse dramatically. It erodes quietly, one rationalization at a time. The family's emotional world becomes radically constricted. There is no room for forgiveness, because forgiveness would invalidate suffering that feels too vast to release. Letting go would mean admitting that the dead will never be avenged, that their pain will never be balanced. And so the living cling to vengeance, not because it heals them, but because abandoning it would make the losses feel meaningless. The curse feeds on this fear of meaninglessness. It convinces each generation that without retaliation, their suffering will vanish into nothing, unacknowledged and unresolved. Revenge becomes a way to preserve memory, even if it destroys the future. What is especially haunting is how the family mistakes endurance for strength. Surviving atrocity after atrocity creates a distorted sense of resilience, one that glorifies the ability to withstand pain rather than to prevent it. Characters are praised for their fortitude, their willingness to carry unbearable burdens, their capacity to act despite horror. But this valorization of endurance becomes another trap. Pain is not questioned. It is honored. Suffering is not resisted. It is inherited. In such a world, healing feels almost immoral, as though peace would betray the dead. The curse also reveals how power magnifies trauma instead of resolving it. Kingship, wealth, and divine favor do not protect the house of Atreus. They intensify its suffering. Authority provides the means to commit greater atrocities, to institutionalize personal grief into public catastrophe. Private wounds become political disasters, and family trauma spills outward into war, sacrifice, and mass death. The family's pain never remains contained. It radiates outward, consuming entire cities and generations of soldiers who have nothing to do with the original crime. This expansion makes the curse feel less like a family problem and more like a contagion. By the end, the tragedy no longer feels like a sequence of events, but like a condition of existence. The house of Atreus does not simply experience suffering. It inhabits fate. Suffering becomes the air they breathe, shaping their instincts before conscious thought can intervene. The myth suggests that when pain becomes environmental, when it surrounds children from birth, it stops being something one reacts to and becomes something one assumes is normal. That normalization is perhaps the cruelest aspect of the curse, because it ensures its own survival without needing constant reinforcement. The final silence left in the wake of the house of Atreus is therefore deeply unsettling. It is not the quiet of peace, but the quiet that follows devastation when there is nothing left to destroy. The gods move on. Society reorganizes. Justice evolves. But the family itself is gone, consumed by the very logic it upheld. What remains is their story, preserved not as comfort but as unease, a reminder that some forms of destruction are slow, cumulative, and self-justifying. In this way, the House of Atreus becomes less a relic of ancient storytelling and more a timeless psychological warning. It shows how easily suffering can be transformed into doctrine, how pain can be inherited as identity, and how violence can masquerade as necessity until no one remembers an alternative. The curse does not roar, it whispers, teaching each generation that retaliation is wisdom, that mercy is weakness, and that the past must always be paid for in blood. And perhaps the most terrifying implication of all is this: the curse ends in myth, not because it is defeated, but because the family is exhausted beyond continuation. The cycle stops not through redemption, but through depletion. And that ending offers no reassurance. Only the sobering recognition that without conscious refusal, without radical compassion, the most cursed family in Greek mythology is never truly confined to myth alone. Even beyond exhaustion, the curse leaves behind a distorted understanding of what it means to be human. Members of the House of Atreus are slowly stripped of ordinary emotional range until their inner lives revolve around a single gravitational center. Reckoning everything is measured against past wrongs and future reprisals. Simple desires, peace, companionship, anonymity, feel unattainable or even illegitimate. To want a quiet life would be to reject the weight of inherited suffering, and that rejection feels like betrayal. The curse convinces its victims that they owe their ancestors not healing, but continuation. Pain becomes a form of loyalty. This loyalty to suffering creates a paradox in which identity is forged through destruction. Characters know who they are only in relation to what they must avenge or endure. Without an enemy, without a debt to repay, they would lose their sense of purpose. The curse thus hollows out the self, replacing inward reflection with outward action. There is no space for introspection, because introspection might lead to doubt, and doubt threatens the entire moral scaffolding that keeps the cycle intact. Action, even horrific action, is preferable to uncertainty. The House of Atreus also demonstrates how fear masquerades as inevitability. Many acts are framed as unavoidable, dictated by prophecy or divine will. Yet beneath this framing lies a profound terror of choice. Choice implies responsibility. Choice implies that things could have been otherwise. By surrendering agency to fate, characters protect themselves from confronting the possibility that the violence could have stopped with them. The curse feels even more suffocating when you consider how time behaves inside the House of Atreus, because time does not move forward in a straight line for this family. It coils back on itself. Past crimes are never truly past. They sit dormant, waiting for the right emotional pressure to burst open again. A murder committed generations earlier still dictates the emotional reality of those not yet born, shaping their fears, loyalties, and moral instincts before they are capable of choosing for themselves. This is what makes the family feel less like a sequence of individuals and more like a single sprawling organism, one that feeds on its own wounds. Every child born into the line inherits not only a name, but a backlog of unfinished violence, as if birth itself is a contract signed in blood. Silence plays a crucial role in sustaining the curse. Many of the most destructive acts occur not only because of hatred, but because of what is not said. Truths hidden, crimes half confessed, guilt buried beneath royal ceremony and public honor. Agamemnon returns from war as a celebrated hero, yet the blood of his daughter is never publicly reckoned with. Clytemnestra rules beside him for years while nurturing a private inferno of grief and rage. Orestes grows up away from his home, shaped by fragments of truth and whispered expectations rather than open dialogue. This suppression creates an emotional pressure cooker in which violence becomes the only available language. When words fail, blades speak. When confession is impossible, spectacle replaces honesty. The gods, rather than acting as moral anchors, often deepen the terror. They issue commands without bearing consequences, manipulate outcomes without enduring suffering, and retreat once mortals are left to deal with the aftermath. Divine justice in this myth is fragmented and contradictory. One god demands a sacrifice, another punishes the act, and a third later absolves it. Mortals are crushed between incompatible moral systems imposed from above, making it impossible to act without sinning. The curse thrives in this contradiction. It turns obedience into guilt and rebellion into sacrilege, ensuring that no path leads to peace. In this sense, the house of Atreus is not only cursed by ancestry, but trapped in a universe where moral clarity is perpetually denied. There is also a chilling absence of ordinary grief. Death is so frequent that it becomes procedural, almost administrative. Bodies pile up faster than emotions can be processed. Funerals, if they happen at all, are overshadowed by plans for revenge. This emotional numbness is itself a form of damage, a sign that the family has lost the ability to mourn in a healthy way. Without mourning, there is no closure. Without closure, the dead continue to demand action. Vengeance becomes a substitute for grief, a way to feel something fey in a world where sorrow has grown too heavy to carry. The curse also distorts identity. Members of the House of Atreus rarely get to be fully human. They are defined by roles imposed upon them: avenger, betrayer, sacrifice, executioner. Individual desire is swallowed by expectation. Orestes does not kill because he wants to. He kills because the story requires him to. Clytemnestra does not merely seek power. She performs the role fate has written for a wronged mother. Even resistance feels scripted. Attempts to escape the cycle only confirm its power, reinforcing the sense that free will exists, only in theory, not in practice. Perhaps the most disturbing element of the curse is how rational it feels from the inside. Each violent act can be logically explained, emotionally justified, even morally defended when viewed in isolation. This is what makes the family so unsettling. There are no simple villains. Each generation believes it is correcting an imbalance left by the last. Each killer views themselves as an instrument of justice rather than cruelty. The horror emerges not from madness alone, but from reason pushed to its most merciless extreme. When logic is divorced from compassion, it becomes lethal. As the story stretches across generations, the audience begins to sense that the curse is less about divine punishment and more about accumulation. Every unresolved crime adds weight to the structure until collapse becomes inevitable. The family does not fall because of a single monstrous act, but because no one is willing or able to absorb the cost of stopping the cycle. To end the curse would require someone to endure injustice without retaliation, to accept unbearable loss without repayment. In the world of the House of Atreus, this is portrayed as almost inhuman, a demand beyond mortal strength. By the time the cycle weakens, what remains of the family is psychologically ravaged. Survival itself feels hollow, stripped of triumph. The myth leaves a lingering unease, suggesting that even when violence ends, it does not undo what has already been shaped. Trauma outlives the events that caused it. The curse may loosen its grip, but it never truly disappears. It becomes memory, behavior, fear, silence. And that may be the darkest truth of all, that the most terrifying curses do not announce themselves with thunder or monsters, but whisper through generations, teaching each new heir that suffering is normal, that cruelty is tradition, and that blood will always demand more blood unless someone, somewhere, chooses to let the debt remain unpaid. What makes the house of Atreus feel endlessly cursed is that even for innocence, Fae becomes a liability within this bloodline. Children are never allowed to exist simply as children. They are future victims, future weapons, future symbols in someone else's moral argument. Iphigenia is sacrificed before she can grow into her own life, reduced to a bargaining chip between a father's ambition and a goddess's pride. Orestes is raised with an expectation already hovering over him, that one day he will have to kill or be killed. Electra grows up steeped in grief so deep that it becomes her defining identity, shaping her entire sense of purpose around revenge. In this family, childhood is merely the waiting room for tragedy. Love does not protect the young, it prepares them for pain. The curse also corrodes language itself. Words like Fae justice, Fae, honor Fae, Fae duty Fae, and Fae necessity Fae are repeated so often that they lose all meaning, becoming excuses rather than ideals. Atreus claims justice when he murders children. Agamemnon claims necessity when he kills his daughter. Clytemnestra claims justice again when she murders her husband. Orestes repeats the cycle, invoking divine command as justification for matricide. Each generation inherits the vocabulary of righteousness without its moral substance, wielding it like a blade polished by tradition. Over time, language stops clarifying truth and instead disguises brutality, allowing cruelty to masquerade as virtue. There is also a profound loneliness embedded in the curse. Despite being surrounded by family, alliances, and divine attention, members of the House of Atreus are fundamentally isolated. No one can truly share their burden because no one else fully inhabits their history. Their suffering is too layered, too ancestral, to be understood by outsiders. Even lovers and allies are temporary, often instrumental rather than intimate. Trust cannot survive in an environment where betrayal is inherited. This isolation amplifies despair, making violence feel like the only way to be seen, heard, or remembered. In a twisted way, killing becomes communication, the only act powerful enough to leave a mark in a world numbed by endless loss. The curse also blurs the boundary between victim and perpetrator so completely that moral judgment becomes unstable. The audience is constantly forced to confront uncomfortable sympathies. We recoil from Atreus, yet understand the humiliation that drove him. We condemn Clytemnestra, yet feel the weight of her grief. We pity Orestes, even as he commits an unforgivable act. This moral ambiguity is not accidental. It is the curse's most insidious feature. By ensuring that every crime is rooted in prior suffering, the myth traps both its characters and its audience in ethical paralysis. There is no clean place to stand, no moment where condemnation feels uncomplicated. The curse spreads outward, implicating everyone who tries to make sense of it. Even the idea of fate within this family feels less like destiny and more like exhaustion. Prophecies do not feel grand or awe-inspiring, they feel heavy, like obligations that must be fulfilled, simply because resisting them requires too much strength. Characters often act not out of belief that the outcome is right, but because they cannot imagine the energy it would take to choose differently. This emotional fatigue accumulates across generations, creating a lineage that seems tired of its own existence, yet unable to stop moving forward. Survival becomes mechanical, stripped of hope, driven by momentum rather than desire. The gods' eventual attempt to civilize justice through trials, courts, and structured law feels almost like an admission of failure. Divine vengeance has proven too chaotic, too contradictory, too cruel. But even this shift comes at the cost of human lives already destroyed. The House of Atreus becomes the sacrifice that allows society to evolve, its suffering transformed into a lesson rather than a warning heeded in time. Progress is purchased with their annihilation. This gives the myth a bitter aftertaste. Order emerges, but only after the cursed family has been thoroughly consumed by the process. Ultimately, the House of Atreus represents the darkest fear embedded in Greek mythology, that suffering, once institutionalized, becomes self-sustaining. It no longer needs hatred or malice to survive. It runs on memory, expectation, and tradition. Violence continues, not because anyone wants it to, but because stopping